If you ever served in Iraq or Afghanistan, you remember the smell before you remember the heat. The heat eventually becomes background noise, a constant oven hum, but the smell, that one stays with you. It's hard to describe, like a mix of melted plastic, diesel exhaust, and the world's worst barbecue. You'd wake up to it, eat with it, fall asleep under it, and joke that it was probably sterilizing you from the inside out. The military called it waste management. Everyone else called it the burn pit. Every base had one, some small enough to fit behind a chow hall, others big enough to have their own weather systems. The one at Balad was the size of several football fields. It burned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The flames glowed orange at night like the gates of hell, and when the wind shifted, the black smoke would roll across the base like a living thing. You could taste it in your teeth. That's not poetry. You could literally taste it. And nobody questioned it. Soldiers joked about it, made memes before memes were even a thing. If the enemy doesn't kill us, the pit will. It became part of the deployment rhythm, sand, sweat, and smoke. You'd see the guys on duty dumping in truckloads of garbage, everything from MRE wrappers to whole vehicles that had seen one too many IEDs. They'd pour on jet fuel, JP-8, the same stuff used in F-16s, and light it up. Waste disposal, 21st century war style. In the early days, the logic made sense. You couldn't exactly run recycling centers in a war zone. There were no EPA inspectors roaming around Baghdad with clipboards and respirators. You needed quick, dirty, and constant disposal. And fire is as old as humanity. The problem was what we were burning, how much, and for how long. It wasn't just trash, it was medical waste, batteries, paint, solvents, uniforms soaked in chemicals, even expired munitions. Sometimes human waste too, because why dig a proper latrine when you can just toss the bucket in the inferno? The result was a chemical cocktail so dense it could probably power a small reactor. But the only thing it powered was long-term illness, something nobody was talking about yet. Out on the line, it was just part of the job. You'd get your gear ready, check your weapon, and walk through a haze so thick you couldn't see 50 feet ahead. The locals thought the Americans were insane. They could see the column of black smoke from miles away. From above, the satellites must have thought the US military was trying to terraform the Middle East into Mordor. At night, when the temperature finally dropped below surface of the sun, the smoke hung low, a greasy fog that clung to your skin. You could shower and still smell it afterward. Guys used to joke about Balad cologne. You'd laugh because the alternative was thinking about what it was doing to your lungs. The thing is, nobody thought about the future. That's not how deployments work. You're thinking about getting through the day, maybe the next patrol, maybe your next flight home. Nobody was planning for what the burn pit was doing to their body 10 years down the line. The chain of command didn't talk about it. The contractors running the pits didn't talk about it. And the Army medical briefings sure as hell didn't talk about it. It was just smoke, and everyone was breathing it. By 2008, the pits were as iconic as the Humvee. They were in every deployment photo, a background detail that never made it into the headlines. But some soldiers started noticing things. The coughing that wouldn't go away, the weird sinus infections, the black mucus you'd spit up in the morning. They joked about Iraqi crud or Afghan funk. They weren't wrong, just about the source. This wasn't the desert, it was the pit. That was the cruel genius of it. The problem was invisible until it wasn't. For every convoy ambush or rocket attack that made the news, there were hundreds of troops standing in a slow-moving cloud of poison, breathing it deep for months on end. You don't think about carcinogens when you're dodging mortars. You just keep moving. The burn pits were never designed to be permanent, but war has a way of turning temporary into routine. And so they burned, for years, for entire rotations of troops, until one day the fires went out. Not because someone decided they were dangerous, but because we finally packed up and left. The smoke faded from the desert sky, but it didn't disappear. It followed the veterans home, invisible, patient, and waiting. Let's start with the obvious question. What the hell is actually in those burn pits? The short answer, everything. Long answer, everything you can imagine, plus things no sane person would ever set on fire. See, on paper, these weren't supposed to be massive bonfires of toxic sludge. The military's field waste management doctrine, which sounds like it should involve clipboards and reflective vests, recommended controlled burning of biodegradable trash only when no other option was available. In practice, no other option translated to every single day for the next decade. Because when you're in a combat zone, logistics win over logic every time. The pits started small, little trenches outside forward operating bases. But as bases grew, so did the trash. By the time we were fully entrenched in Iraq and Afghanistan, these things had evolved into industrial scale incinerators without filters, regulations, or oversight. At Joint Base Balad, the biggest of them all, the pit stretched over 10 acres, roughly the size of 10 football fields. Troops nicknamed it the Balad Burn Pit, though the mouth of hell would have been more accurate. It consumed 200 tons of waste a day, fed by bulldozers, dump trucks, and a steady stream of JP-8 jet fuel. The smoke could be seen from miles away. It didn't just pollute the air, it was the air. And the ingredients list? Plastic bottles, styrofoam trays, and shrink wrap, wooden pallets soaked in diesel, paint cans, solvents, and motor oil, medical waste, syringes, IV bags, used bandages, sometimes even amputated limbs, expired food, batteries, electronics, computers, uniforms, vehicle parts, furniture, and sometimes entire vehicles. And when things got backed up, they tossed in human waste too, because why not complete the circle of biological horror? In any other country, burning half that list would get you arrested. But in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was just another Tuesday. The Department of Defense was supposed to minimize open-air burning, but they contracted out the job to civilian companies, primarily KBR, a Halliburton subsidiary. You might remember them from such hits as Overbilling the Government and Water That Makes You Sick. Their contract included waste disposal, but nobody told them how to do it. So they did it the easiest way: fire. The irony is that by 2004, the US military had advanced battlefield tech that could track a signal insurgent cell phone halfway across the desert. But when it came to garbage disposal, we went full caveman. If you asked a soldier in 2007 what was in the air, he'd tell you whatever we lit on fire yesterday. The worst part was the jet fuel. JP-8 burns hot and dirty. It's packed with hydrocarbons, additives, and trace metals. When you pour it on top of burning electronics and medical waste, you get a chemical soup straight out of a science fiction nightmare. Dioxins, benzene, formaldehyde, arsenic, mercury, and a few dozen other things you can't pronounce without a PhD or a tumor. Troops didn't have masks, no respirators, no filtration. Sometimes the burn pit detail was a punishment assignment. Stand next to a toxic inferno for hours and shovel ash. If you complained, the response was simple: suck it up, soldier. Because back then, the pit wasn't seen as a threat. It was seen as a convenience. Let's put this in perspective. At home, the EPA requires industrial waste incinerators to burn at over 1800 Fahrenheit and use scrubbers to catch particulates. At Balad, the burn pit ran at roughly half that temperature, open to the wind with no filtering. Imagine lighting your entire household trash pile on fire, adding in a car battery, your laptop, and a few gallons of jet fuel, then standing downwind. Now multiply that by 200 tons a day and call it standard operating procedure. But here's the thing, it wasn't just the big bases. Smaller FOBs, forward operating bases, had their own pits, sometimes just a few hundred square feet, dug by bulldozer and manned by whoever drew the short straw that week. And since these bases were often near civilian areas, local populations were breathing the same smoke. There were reports of Iraqi villagers getting nosebleeds, respiratory infections, and strange rashes. Nobody wrote that up in the after-action reports. Some soldiers tried to raise alarms early. Emails and internal memos began circulating. Phrases like possible long-term exposure risk, and toxic particulate concentration exceeds acceptable limits. But acceptable limits were a luxury of peacetime. In war, the mission came first, and everything else could burn, literally. By the late 2000s, the pits were a known feature of every rotation. Incoming units got handover briefings that mentioned them casually. Here's your tent, here's the chow hall, there's the pit. Don't breathe too deep. The black plumes would drift across the sunrise like man-made storms. Some pilots flying in and out of Balad reported visibility issues. The smoke was that thick. You couldn't escape it, even from the air. And yet the absurdity of it all barely registered. Soldiers cracked jokes about getting free chemo in advance. Contractors shrugged and said it was within contract guidelines. Commanders had bigger problems: enemy mortars, insurgent attacks, logistics nightmares. The pit was an afterthought. Nobody was collecting exposure data. Nobody was wearing sensors. Nobody was thinking about what happens when that smoke settles into your lungs. Looking back, it's insane. But in context, it was just one more piece of wartime improvisation. Every generation of soldiers had their version of "we didn't know better." For Vietnam, it was Agent Orange. For the Gulf War, it was oil fires and nerve agent alarms. For Iraq and Afghanistan, it was a bottomless pit of burning trash. And like every bad idea that starts with temporary solution, it stuck around for years. Because in war, temporary is just permanent with bad paperwork. The smoke kept rising, thick, black, and constant, marking time across deployments. It didn't matter which branch, which base, or which year. The burn pit was universal. The only real difference was how close you were to it when the wind shifted. If you ever took a chemistry class in high school, you probably remember one rule: don't mix unknown substances and then light them on fire. In Iraq and Afghanistan, that was the entire job description. The burn pits were less waste management and more open-air chemical reaction experiment. Every time someone dumped a truckload of trash and drenched it in jet fuel, they weren't just making smoke. They were creating a toxic soup of compounds that'd make a supervillain proud. Let's talk about what that smoke actually was. When you burn things like plastic, electronics, medical waste, and paint, you're not just making ash. You're making an airborne cocktail of fine particulate matter. Microscopic particles, small enough to slip past your nose hair, past your lungs, straight into your bloodstream. They carry heavy metals like lead and arsenic, volatile organic compounds like benzene and formaldehyde, and a nice sprinkling of polyacrylic aromatic hydrocarbons, a class of chemicals so carcinogenic they come with hazard labels that basically say, "Try not to exist near this." And it wasn't just what we burned, it was how we burned it. Jet fuel like JP8 is full of aromatic hydrocarbons, the same molecules found in gasoline, except these come with military-grade additives to help it not freeze, not smoke, and not explode prematurely. That's great in a jet engine. In an open pit, it turns every garbage fire into a chemical factory running 24/7. At Balad, air samples later revealed dioxins, the same family of compounds found in Agent Orange. These molecules didn't just vanish when the fire goes out. They bind to dust, cling to your clothes, and lodge themselves in fatty tissue. The human body has no idea what to do with them, so it just keeps them forever. Veterans started coming home with what doctors started calling Iraq lung, chronic coughs that wouldn't go away, sinus infections that turned into asthma, perfectly healthy 20-somethings showing up with shortness of breath, fatigue, and weird rashes. Some developed rare cancers or autoimmune disorders that usually take decades to appear, except they were showing up in people barely old enough to rent a car. One of the first people to connect the dots was Dr. Anthony Sesma, a pulmonary specialist from Stony Brook University. He studied returning service members who had been stationed near burn pits and found scarring and inflammation deep inside their lungs, the kind normally seen in chemical factory workers or people exposed to industrial accidents. The official term was constrictive bronchiolitis, a fancy way of saying your small airways are collapsing and there's no cure. Here's the kicker. Most of the affected veterans passed standard lung tests. On paper, they looked fine, but when surgeons actually opened them up and looked at the tissue, it was wrecked, shrunken, fibrotic, scarred beyond repair. You can't see that on a chest x-ray. You find it with a biopsy or an autopsy. Now, the military isn't stupid. They have environmental scientists, air sampling equipment, and health officers. They knew the pits were dirty. As early as 2006, internal reports warned about the potential health risks associated with exposure to burn pit emissions. But the problem was data. Nobody had hard numbers. How much exposure, how long, what chemicals, what conditions. And without numbers, bureaucracy shrugs. The Department of Defense's logic boiled down to this. 1, we can't prove it's harmful without long-term studies. 2, we can't run long-term studies while we're still fighting a war. 3, therefore, it's not harmful yet. Classic military reasoning. If you ignore the evidence long enough, it becomes a budget line for someone else to deal with later. Meanwhile, troops on the ground were improvising their own protective measures. Some wrapped scarves or shirts around their faces. Others just held their breath and hoped the wind shifted. Gas masks were for chemical attacks, not your own trash fire. You could request a respirator, sure, but good luck getting that approved when your commander was already down 3 trucks, 2 interpreters, and a half a pallet of bottled water. The human cost didn't show up immediately. It crept in after redeployment. The slow shortness of breath climbing stairs, the fatigue, the mysterious diagnoses, lupus, bronchitis, cancer. The VA doctors weren't prepared for it. There was no checkbox on the intake form for served near massive plume of burning chemicals. So veterans got labeled as asthmatic, or told it was allergies, or probably stress. The stories started stacking up. A Marine who worked next to a pit at Camp Fallujah for a year and came home with throat cancer. A convoy driver from Bagram who lost lung capacity before turning 30. Families of dead veterans connecting the dots that the government refused to draw. It became clear that this wasn't just a few bad cases. This was systemic. And the smoke didn't discriminate. It hit soldiers, airmen, Marines, contractors, and even local civilians. The difference was, only one of those groups had a chain of command that could order them to stand next to it every day. Scientists began publishing research. Independent labs analyzed the dust from Balad and Kandahar. They found fine particulate matter with a chemical profile eerily similar to industrial incinerator emissions, except 100 times dirtier. The dust contained everything from depleted uranium to heavy metals and polychlorinated dibenzodioxins, the same stuff the EPA classifies as no safe exposure level. That phrase, no safe exposure level, tells you everything. The kind of smoke coming out of those pits would trigger an environmental evacuation in any U.S. city, but overseas, we called it routine operations. What made it worse was the invisibility of it. You could see the smoke, but you couldn't see the damage it was doing. You could feel fine for years, then one day wake up and realize your lungs had aged 3 decades. Burn pits didn't just scar soldiers' bodies, they eroded their trust. The more veterans got sick, the more the system insisted there wasn't enough evidence. It was deja vu from Vietnam, the same bureaucratic shell game, just updated for the war on terror. You'd think by the 21st century we'd learned that toxic smoke is bad for humans. But apparently, common sense still needs a peer-reviewed study. By 2010, the research was piling up. By 2012, lawsuits were filed against KBR and Halliburton. By 2014, Congress was holding hearings. But in those early years, when the air was thick and the pits burned all day, nobody was listening. And that's how thousands of troops became lab rats in the world's largest uncontrolled toxic exposure experiment. Not by enemy action, not by insurgent weaponry, but by their own side's garbage fire. If there's one thing the U.S. military does better than fighting wars, it's denying responsibility for what happens afterward. That's not cynicism, it's institutional muscle memory. We've been here before. Agent Orange in Vietnam, depleted uranium in the Gulf, mystery illnesses from Desert Storm. So when Iraq and Afghanistan veterans started coming home with lungs that sounded like gravel in a blender, it wasn't exactly shocking that the official line was, "There's no consistent evidence." Let's set the scene. It's 2006 to 2010. The wars are dragging on. Public attention is fading. Troops are rotating home with coughs, chest tightness, migraines, fatigue, the kind of symptoms that could be blamed on anything. Sandstorms, pollen, cigarettes, too much time near diesel exhaust. The system's first reflex? Blame the soldier, not the smoke. You'd show up at the VA clinic coughing like a chimney and they'd ask, "Do you smoke?" "Yes." "Well, there you go." Never mind that you only started smoking after 6 months of living next to a flaming pit of toxic sludge. That didn't make it into the chart. The DoD launched a few studies, the kind that cost millions and conclude nothing. More data needed. Insufficient evidence of causal link. The classic bureaucratic loop. Study the problem until it dies of old age. Meanwhile, the symptoms were stacking up. Thousands of veterans reported identical patterns. Shortness of breath, chronic bronchitis, weird immune problems, migraines, cancers that shouldn't appear in people under 40. Many had been stationed at the same bases, Balad, Kandahar, Bagram. The dots practically connected themselves, but officialdom still insisted it was inconclusive. The public barely noticed. There were no dramatic photos, no mushroom clouds, just invisible smoke and invisible damage. Burn pits didn't have the spectacle of combat. No explosions, no firefights, just a slow motion poisoning of everyone downwind. Some of the first real noise came not from the government, but from veterans themselves. People like Rosie Torres, whose husband Leroy, an Army Reserve captain, came home from Balad in 2008 and started getting sick. Chronic migraines, breathing problems, cognitive issues. The VA told him it wasn't service connected. He and Rosie didn't buy it, so they did what good soldiers do when command ignores them. They started their own mission. In 2009, they founded Burn Pits 360, a grassroots organization to document cases and demand recognition. Their database started filling up with names. Young soldiers, Marines, airmen, contractors, all with eerily similar stories. They weren't conspiracy theorists, they just had matching symptoms, matching deployment dates, and matching exposure histories. But fighting the VA is like trying to bench press a tank. The bureaucracy is built to delay, not decide. Every claim required proof of exposure, which was impossible because the DoD never tracked exposure. You couldn't request your burn pit records because they didn't exist. It was the perfect catch-22. Prove you were poisoned by something we never measured. And when veterans sued the contractors, mainly KBR, they ran into another wall, immunity. Because KBR was working under military authority, they were effectively untouchable. Courts ruled that wartime contractors couldn't be sued for decisions made under military control. Translation, they burned your trash, you breathe the fumes, and legally, nobody's responsible. By 2012, the lawsuits were dismissed. The appeals dragged on for years, but the damage was done. Not just to the lungs of veterans, but to their trust in the institutions that sent them there. Doctors like Dr. Sesma and Dr. Miller, the ones who found the scarring in soldiers' lungs, became thorns in the government's side. Their research made headlines in medical journals, but headlines don't move policy. For that, you need outrage, and outrage requires visibility. Unfortunately, burn pits were invisible by design. If you were in the Pentagon during those years, you'd hear phrases like, "no statistically significant link," "within acceptable exposure limits," and "awaiting further peer review." It's the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug. You can almost hear the PowerPoint clicking forward. To the troops, it sounded more like, "you're on your own." The VA's official stance stayed the same for years. Not enough data, not enough evidence. They created a voluntary burn pit registry in 2014, which was a polite way of saying, you can sign up and tell us you're dying, but it probably won't change anything. Over 200,000 veterans eventually registered, many of them already sick, some of them dying. The data just sat there, waiting for someone to care. Meanwhile, the denials kept coming. Veterans who filed disability claims for lung disease, cancer, or autoimmune disorders were routinely denied. Between 2007 and 2018, more than 3/4 of burn pit-related claims were rejected. The official reasoning? No proven service connection. Let that sink in. You can get a Purple Heart for breathing in shrapnel, but not for breathing in jet fuel smoke. What made it worse was the déjà vu. Vietnam vets had gone through this exact same bureaucratic gauntlet. It took decades for Agent Orange to be recognized, and even then the government tried to minimize costs by narrowing who qualified. Iraq and Afghanistan vets were now starring in the sequel, Agent Orange 2, now it's airborne. And because the burn pits didn't leave visible scars, they were easy to dismiss. The coughs and fatigue didn't show up on x-rays. The cancers took years to develop. It was a perfect storm of delay, denial, and damage control. You can almost sympathize with the bureaucrats. Admitting it was real would mean acknowledging that the government had poisoned tens of thousands of its own troops. That's not a press release you want to write. So they hid behind the phrase, insufficient evidence, knowing full well that the only thing insufficient was accountability. But veterans don't go quietly. They organized, they spoke out, they showed up at hearings coughing into microphones. They held up photos of dead friends. They told stories of 30-year-olds dying of lung disease while the VA claimed it wasn't service-related. The government's response was textbook, slow, technical, and just detached enough to seem reasonable. We recognize the concern, they said. We'll study it further. Translation, we'll wait until enough of you are dead to make this manageable. For a lot of veterans, that's exactly what it felt like. The denial phase wasn't just about science. It was about money, liability, and saving face. Acknowledging burn pits meant paying billions in compensation and admitting that for nearly 2 decades, the U.S. military had been running open-air toxic waste fires next to its own people. That's a tough pill to swallow, especially when the people who lit those fires were following orders. But denial has a shelf life. Eventually the evidence and the body count started catching up. And that's when the story began to change. By the early 2010s, the burn pits had stopped burning, but the war over what they'd done was just getting started. The fires might have gone out in Balad and Kandahar, but they were still burning in VA waiting rooms across America. You could find the same scene in every one of them. A veteran sitting in a plastic chair, paperwork in hand, inhaler in the other, trying to explain to a claims officer why he couldn't breathe. I worked next to the burn pit. The officer would nod politely, type a few things, and say, "There's no service connection for that condition." Translation, "Good luck, kid." That's when veterans started realizing they'd have to fight the government harder than they fought the enemy. The first big wave of awareness didn't come from Congress or the Pentagon. It came from Facebook. By 2010, veterans were creating private groups to share stories, coughing, wheezing, unexplained diagnoses, cancer at 35. Guys who'd never met before started realizing their symptoms lined up like coordinates on a map. Same bases, same deployments, same black smoke, same denials. Then came Burn Pits 360, run by Rosie and Leroy Torres. Their database became a lifeline, part memorial wall, part evidence archive. They began collecting testimonies from all branches, including families of veterans who had already died. Each story told the same haunting pattern. Healthy before deployment, sick after, VA says no. They started showing up at hearings, news interviews, podcasts, anyone who would listen. Rosie Torres became the face of a movement the government didn't want to talk about. She wasn't a scientist or a lobbyist, just a military spouse watching her husband waste away while paperwork stalled. She spoke like someone who'd run out of patience, but not out of fight. For years, the movement simmered quietly, ignored by most politicians, occasionally acknowledged by the Pentagon as a concern. The Department of Defense did what bureaucracies do best, created more committees. They released bland statements like, "While potential health effects cannot be ruled out, no definitive causal relationship has been established." That's bureaucrat for don't sue us yet. Meanwhile, the stories piled up. Retired Master Sergeant Wes Carter founded the Burn Pits 360 Registry and later the Burn Pits Veterans Association. Dr. Sesma and Dr. Miller kept publishing studies showing real lung damage in exposed troops. Every report chipped away at the official wall of denial, like termites in a filing cabinet. Then the media started paying attention. CNN did exposés, 60 Minutes ran a segment, local news stations began interviewing veterans dying of rare cancers before age 40. The visuals were powerful. Young, fit soldiers hooked up to oxygen tanks, holding photos of burn pits that looked like volcanoes. It was hard to argue that this was inconclusive. And then the big gun showed up, Jon Stewart. After fighting for 9/11 first responders, Stewart turned his attention to veterans poisoned by burn pits. He didn't use academic language, he used anger. He called out senators by name. He mocked Congress for caring about veterans only when it looked good on camera. And because he was Jon Stewart, people listened. Stewart joined Rosie Torres in Burn Pits 360 in Washington. He rallied veterans, staged press events, and started hammering the message home. These men and women were willing to sacrifice their lives for this country. The least this country can do is not kill them after the fact. For years, the government had hidden behind the phrase, no evidence. Stewart's counterpoint was brutally simple. The evidence is buried with them. By 2021, the fight had gone national. The issue wasn't just medical anymore. It was moral. Lawmakers were cornered. You couldn't wrap yourself in a flag on Veterans Day while ignoring the people gasping for air because they served under that same flag. Stewart, Torres, and a coalition of veterans groups started pushing for what would become the PACT Act, short for the Promise to Address Comprehensive Toxics. The name sounded like something a committee came up with, but its purpose was clear. Force the government to finally recognize that burn pit exposure caused real, measurable harm. The bill didn't just happen overnight. It took years of hearings, rallies, and public shaming. At one point, veterans literally camped outside the Capitol in the rain, holding signs that said, "We already gave enough." Senators walked past them on their way to catered lunches. Cameras rolled. America watched. Then came one of the most infamous moments in modern veteran advocacy. In July 2022, the Senate initially failed to pass the PACT Act after months of promising they would. It was a procedural stunt, but try explaining that to a guy with stage 4 lung cancer. Stewart went nuclear on live television, calling out lawmakers for celebrating tax cuts one week and abandoning veterans the next. His press conference rant, equal parts fury and heartbreak, went viral. He didn't talk like a politician, he talked like a pissed off NCO. If this is America first, then America's got a hell of a funny way of showing it, he said. These people fought for you, and you fight against them? The backlash was instant. Within days, the Senate reversed course. The PACT Act passed. For once, outrage worked. But even after victory, the celebration was quiet. Because for many veterans, it came too late. Some had died waiting for approval. Others had gone bankrupt paying for their own treatment. Families were left to fill out paperwork for benefits their loved ones would never live to use. Still, for the first time in decades, a generation of veterans saw a government admit, in writing, that yes, the smoke was poison, and yes, it was our fault. The PACT Act would expand health care and disability benefits for more than 3.5 million veterans. It made dozens of cancers and respiratory illnesses presumptive, meaning the burden of proof shifted from the soldier to the system. It was the government saying, okay, you don't have to prove it anymore, we believe you. It shouldn't have taken 15 years, thousands of deaths, and a comedian screaming at Congress to get there, but it did. Because that's how America handles toxic exposures, one angry generation at a time. For the veterans who'd fought, the recognition wasn't victory, it was vindication. The government had finally said the quiet part out loud, that the biggest threat in Iraq and Afghanistan wasn't always the enemy. Sometimes it was the trash fire next to your tent. And for a lot of them, that acknowledgement came just in time to say, I told you so, before the next round of chemo. When the PACT Act finally passed in August 2022, you could almost hear a collective sigh from veterans across the country. Not of relief, but of exhaustion. 15 years of coughing, paperwork, denials, and funerals had finally forced Washington to admit the obvious. Breathing burning trash for a year probably isn't good for you. The full name, the Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson Honoring Our Promise to Address Comprehensive Toxics Act, said it all. Robinson had deployed to Camp Victory in Iraq, where burn pits ran day and night. He came home, got sick, and spent years fighting through the VA before dying of a rare lung cancer in 2020. The law that bore his name was both a tribute and an indictment, proof that the only way to get Washington's attention is to die slowly and publicly enough. At its core, the PACT Act was a legal acknowledgement of what veterans had been saying since the early 2000s, that toxic exposure during service can kill you just as surely as enemy fire. It expanded healthcare eligibility to millions of post-9/11 veterans and established presumptive conditions, meaning that if you served in certain places at certain times, the VA would automatically assume your illness was caused by toxic exposure. That word, presumptive, might sound like bureaucratic jargon, but for veterans it was a revolution. Before, you had to prove your exposure. You needed medical records showing proximity to a pit, medical evidence tying your cancer to that exposure, and a miracle of paperwork alignment to get compensation. The PACT Act flipped the script. Now it was on the VA to disprove your claim. For once, the burden of proof wasn't on the guy who got poisoned. It was on the system that did the poisoning. It covered more than 20 new conditions linked to burn pit exposure, including respiratory cancers, chronic bronchitis, asthma, and a wide array of neurological and autoimmune disorders. It also reached back to earlier wars, expanding benefits for Vietnam and Gulf War veterans exposed to Agent Orange and other toxins. It was the most sweeping veterans' health legislation in decades, the toxic exposure equivalent of the GI Bill. The law didn't just offer medical coverage, it also restructured the VA from the ground up. It established new screening procedures for every veteran enrolled in VA healthcare, requiring toxic exposure questionnaires at every visit. It created research funding for long-term environmental exposure studies, something the Pentagon had conveniently not gotten around to for 20 years. It even authorized new VA facilities in underserved regions, anticipating the flood of veterans finally eligible for care. For once, the VA's messaging wasn't buried in red tape. They launched TV ads, social media campaigns, and mobile enrollment clinics that toured the country. "You don't have to prove it anymore," the ad said. "If you served, we believe you." And that mattered, because belief, official, written, codified belief, was what veterans had been denied for nearly 2 decades. Of course, in true government fashion, the rollout was messy. The VA's website crashed from the surge of applications, wait times ballooned, call centers jammed. Some veterans who applied for benefits found themselves stuck in digital limbo for months. It wasn't malicious, it was just the system being overwhelmed by the sheer number of people who had been ignored for years. Within the first 12 months, the VA received over 1.6 million claims under the PACT Act, an avalanche of paperwork that revealed just how deep the problem was. The agency hired thousands of new claims processors and doctors, but the scale was unprecedented. They weren't just processing benefits, they were digging through 2 decades of denial. Still, progress came. By late 2024, more than 500,000 veterans had been approved for new or expanded benefits under the Act. The VA reported record increases in healthcare enrollment. Veterans once told, "It's all in your head," were now getting treatments, compensation, and finally, acknowledgement. For many, though, the victory was bittersweet. They'd spent years begging the government to admit the truth, only to see it happen too late for their friends. Burn Pits 360, now a formal advocacy nonprofit, kept an updated memorial wall of the fallen, names stretching into the thousands. Each one a casualty of peacetime indifference. Jon Stewart stayed in the fight too, showing up at VA events and reminding Congress that accountability doesn't end when the cameras leave. His advocacy had turned into something more durable, a cultural memory. Burn pits were now part of the national conversation. You could say Balad in a VFW hall, and people would nod in grim recognition. Even the Pentagon, famous for its selective amnesia, began using the term toxic exposure in official reports. They launched new studies to analyze the long-term effects of particulate inhalation from burn pits. Translation? They started researching what they should have known 20 years ago. But no amount of reform can erase what happened. Thousands died before anyone took it seriously. Countless more will spend the rest of their lives on oxygen or chemo. The PACT Act didn't fix the past. It simply drew a line under it and said, from this point forward, we'll do better. There's a particular kind of bitterness in that. Veterans have a long memory, and the PACT Act, for all it's good, still feels like a receipt for damage done. And the fight isn't over. The VA still has backlogs. Some conditions are still under review. Advocates are pushing to add brain cancers, fertility issues, and other diseases linked to toxic exposure. There's also the unspoken problem, local civilians and contractors who breathe the same smoke but don't qualify for anything. The law covers American troops, not the interpreters who stood beside them or the Iraqi kids who grew up downwind. History will have to write its own footnote for them. Still, for once, the system blinked. It admitted fault. The United States government put in writing that yes, it poisoned its own. That's not justice, but that's something resembling accountability. And in a strange way, the PACT Act did more than just provide health care. It restored a small piece of trust. Veterans learned that if they yelled loud enough, for long enough, with enough names on the list, the machine eventually moves. Slowly, grudgingly, but it moves. When the bill finally became law, President Biden, whose own son Beau had died of brain cancer after serving near burn pits in Iraq, called it the most significant expansion of benefits and services for toxic exposed veterans in more than 30 years. For once, a politician wasn't overselling it. But the real authors of the PACT Act weren't in Washington. They were the veterans who coughed through testimony, the families who held photos at rallies, the doctors who refused to shut up, and the activists who slept on Capitol Hill steps to make sure the country saw them. That's the American way of fixing things, apparently. Ignore the warning, deny the damage, and then let the people suffering drag the truth into daylight by hand. When the last burn pit was finally extinguished, there wasn't a ceremony, no bugles, no folded flags, just a bulldozer pushing over a mound of ash, burying years of black smoke and bureaucratic silence under a few feet of dirt. The wars ended, the bases emptied, and the pits, once visible from space, disappeared from sight. But their legacy didn't. It came home in the lungs, bloodstreams, and medical records of everyone who lived near them. Every generation of American veterans has its invisible enemy. For the greatest generation, it was mustard gas and radiation. For Vietnam, it was Agent Orange. For Desert Storm, it was oil fires and depleted uranium. And for Iraq and Afghanistan, it was the burn pit. A 21st century reminder that sometimes the deadliest weapon on the battlefield isn't pointed at the enemy, it's the one pointed at ourselves. The parallels are painful. After Vietnam, it took over a decade for the government to admit Agent Orange caused harm. The burn pit timeline followed the same script almost to the year. The denial, the lawsuits, the no proven link, the slow trickle of recognition. We repeat this play every generation like a national ritual. Make a mess, ignore it, then build a memorial when enough people die. And like all legacies born of neglect, the burn pit story raises the same old questions. Who's accountable? You can't point to one villain. The blame is diffused, scattered across commanders, contractors, and bureaucrats. KBR built the pits and ran them without oversight. The Department of Defense looked the other way because logistics mattered more than lungs. Congress funded wars faster than it funded cleanup. The VA treated symptoms instead of causes. Nobody signed a document that said, let's poison the troops. But 1,000 small decisions added up to exactly that. There's a certain absurdity to it, $1 trillion military with stealth bombers, satellite-guided missiles, and night vision so good it can read a cigarette pack from orbit. And yet the best waste management system it could come up with was a bonfire fueled by jet fuel and hubcaps. The Pentagon spent decades studying fourth-generation warfare and hybrid conflict, but never paused to study what happens when you burn medical waste next to a barracks. If that sounds harsh, it's because veterans earned the right to be harsh. They served under orders, did their jobs, and trusted that someone smarter, higher up, or further back had done the math. They didn't sign up for lung disease. They signed up to fight a war. The legacy of burn pits isn't just medical, it's cultural. It reshaped how the military thinks about environmental hazards. Every new base now has strict rules about waste disposal, air monitoring, and incineration. The Department of Defense now includes environmental exposure tracking in deployment records, something that didn't exist when the smoke was rising over Ballad. It's progress, but it came at the cost of thousands of lives and a mountain of red tape. It also changed how America views veterans. For years, thank you for your service became a reflex. Easy to say, hard to mean. The burn pit fight forced the country to confront what supporting the troops actually looks like when the cameras are gone. It's not parades or hashtags. It's legislation, healthcare, and accountability. It's making sure the people we send to war aren't slowly killed by our own negligence. The irony is that many of the same soldiers who shoveled trash into the pits now volunteer to speak about toxic exposure at VA events. They stand behind tables stacked with pamphlets, wearing oxygen tubes or compression vests, telling the next generation not to let history repeat itself. It's grim, but it's also deeply American, turning tragedy into advocacy because nobody else will. And still, some things remain unresolved. Civilians who worked on bases or lived nearby have little to no recourse. Iraq and Afghan interpreters who stood beside U.S. troops breathe the same air but don't qualify for benefits. Contractors who ran the pits under government orders still operate freely, shielded by legal immunity. The burn pit story is one of accountability for some and none for others. Even now, the science keeps evolving. Researchers are finding new connections between burn pit exposure and cardiovascular disease, neurological decline, and infertility. The VA is starting collecting genetic data to understand why some veterans get sick and others don't. It's progress, but it also means we're still learning what the smoke really did. The fires may be gone, but the data is still smoldering. And then there's the personal legacy, the quiet one. The family that keeps an oxygen tank in the living room. The spouse filling out claims forms every year like clockwork. The kids growing up hearing stories of the pit, the way other families talk about battlefields. These are the aftershocks of policy decisions made by people who never had to stand downwind of them. In 2022, when President Biden signed the PACT Act, he called it a promise fulfilled. It was, but it was also an apology decades overdue. He mentioned his son Beau, who served near a burn pit in Iraq and later died of brain cancer. His voice cracked mid-sentence, not because of politics, but because of grief. For once, the distance between commander-in-chief and soldier was gone. Just one father among many who watched his child die from the same invisible enemy. That's what accountability looks like in America. Late, imperfect, and written in stone after the fact. The burn pit crisis isn't just a footnote to the war on terror. It's a warning label for the next war. A reminder that even the most advanced military on earth can still poison itself through complacency. Someday, when historians write about Iraq and Afghanistan, they'll mention the insurgencies, the counterinsurgency doctrine, the surge, the politics. But buried beneath that will be another story. The one about the black smoke that hung over the bases like a curse, and the veterans who came home breathing ghosts. Because in the end, the burn pits did what wars always do. They created casualties long after the shooting stopped. Only this time, the battlefield followed them home. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave, you